So you finally found time at the weekend to go out and shoot some landscape photography. You drive to that awesome location and you're thinking about all the professional photos that you're gonna take with your fancy new camera. You line up the perfect shot, you hit the shutter button, and you're excited. So you race home, throw your SD card in your computer, and the highlights of your image are blown out and your perfect shot looks, quite frankly, crap. And there's nothing you can do about it now because you made one fundamental mistake that could have easily been avoided. You shot JPEG instead of RAW, and now the moment that you tried to capture is quite literally gone forever. Now, I know that there is a heated debate inside the photography community about whether you should shoot JPEG or RAW, and there are people entrenched on both sides of this argument. But I promise you that after watching this video, you're going to change your camera settings to RAW and you're never going to look back. And it may be a hard pill to swallow, but this is the only way that you're ever going to be able to create the professional level landscape photos that you're looking for. Now, for me to explain why you must shoot in RAW, I've got to explain what a RAW file actually is. And very simply, a RAW file is the unprocessed data from your camera sensor. A JPEG image, on the other hand, is your camera manufacturer's interpretation of that data. So let's say I'm taking a picture of a banana. Well, your camera's going to do a pretty good job of interpreting the data from your camera sensor and creating a convincing JPEG of, well, a banana. However, if I'm outside shooting a landscape shot and there's some dramatic light, well, my camera doesn't know whether to expose for the bright sun, to raise the exposure so my shadows aren't all noisy, and well, it starts to, quite frankly, panic when it realizes that there's no idea what the colors are supposed to look like when there are bright oranges, blues, or even greens in the scene. Never mind if there's fog or there's snow or there's rain in the image. At that point, you're putting your photography into the realm of luck and chance rather than skill. And look, to be fair, your poor camera is going to do its best, but it's often going to spit out amateur-looking snapshots like this and this when you ask it to do all this heavy lifting for you to create these JPEG files. So I think it's fair to say that shooting in RAW is going to give us more creative control over our shots. But what exactly does it give us control over? Well, if you've ever come home from a shoot and looked at your JPEG images and you've gone to edit them and they look like this or this, then, well, you should have shot RAW. And why is this the case? Well, it comes down to the number of bits that are stored in each of these two file formats. And we won't go into the weeds here, but a bit is how many values can be stored in a single unit of information. So a 1-bit image would store black or white. A 2-bit image would store 4 values, so it could be black, white, and 2 grey tones in between. Now, JPEGs are 8-bit files. They store 8 bits for red, 8 bits for green, 8 bits for blue, which means that JPEGs can display 256 levels of red, 256 levels of green, and 256 levels of blue. And because of the fixed number of shades that are available, JPEG files have a dynamic range of around 8 stops of light. Now, to display a photo on a computer screen, for example, this dynamic range is actually perfect because most SDR monitors, so standard dynamic range monitors, have a dynamic range of around 8 stops. So the JPEG image file format is great to use at the end of your imaging process. The issue arises when we try to use it to capture our initial image before we even get a chance to edit it. This is because a sunset, for example, can contain 12 to 18 stops of light. So if we try and capture it with an 8-bit JPEG file, we're going to either miss the shadows or we're going to miss the highlights because we just don't have enough dynamic range to capture the entire scene. And this is where the RAW file format comes in. Right, so I took this image in Lofoten in Norway earlier on in the year, and it's a great example of a high dynamic range shot that would have been, quite frankly, impossible to capture and edit if I'd shot it as a JPEG image. Because I was actually at this point shooting completely the opposite direction, and my mate Stu shouted at me, and he frantically pointed towards the epic sunset that was going on behind me. So I spun around, I adjusted my shutter speed so that I was pushing the highlights right to the end of the right-hand side of my histogram, then I fired off some frames. Now, my Sony camera shoots 14-bit RAW files, so that is obviously much bigger than the 8 bits and 256 values that a JPEG can store. The 14-bit RAW files coming from my camera can store 16,384 values. So with that, rather than the 8 stops of dynamic range that a JPEG can produce, a RAW file like this, coming from my Sony camera, can capture almost 15 stops of dynamic range. And all of that basically means that I can pull this RAW file into Lightroom and I can start editing it, and I can raise the shadows to make them visible in the scene without adding any additional noise to my image. And this, quite frankly, is kind of like black magic. And it's possible because my camera has captured more data than my screen that I'm editing this image on can actually display. And so when I raise the shadows, the data is already there, I'm just making it more visible. That's pretty cool, right? And this is the reason that I tell everyone who's working through my landscape mastery program that they've got to shoot in RAW if they want to be able to achieve professional level results, because to achieve a professional level landscape results, you've got to edit your photos. Now, something else that gets covered in my program regularly is white balance. And this is important because getting your white balance wrong is a surefire way to create snapshots rather than landscape images that you can be proud of. And luckily for us, RAW can help with that too. So take a look at these two images. One of them has an accurate white balance, and in the other image, the white balance is completely wrong. The image on the left looks terrible, and the image on the right obviously looks way better. And the annoying thing? Well, the incorrect white balance was selected by the camera when the image was taken, whereas I selected the white balance for the image on the right-hand side. Now you might be thinking, what the heck has this got to do with shooting with RAW versus JPEG? Well, a JPEG file bakes the white balance into the shot. The process goes: your camera takes the shot, it turns the RAW file in the camera into a color image, it applies what it thinks is the white balance to the image, then it renders the image as an 8-bit JPEG, and it throws away all of the original camera sensor data that may be useful at this point if we wanted to change the white balance after the fact. Now, if the white balance in your JPEG image is slightly wrong, then maybe you can get away with tweaking it. But if it's way off because the camera has, for whatever reason, just chosen the wrong white balance when it took the image, you are absolutely knackered. Now, RAW files manage their white balance a little bit differently. With a RAW file, it keeps all of that sensor data, color data, image data, keeps all of that intact. And what it does is the camera attaches what it thinks might be the right white balance settings as metadata. So rather than it being bounced down into the image, it's just stored there in the background. That means that you can open your RAW file in Lightroom and change the white balance to your heart's content with zero consequences to your image quality. And this has saved my ass so many times. So much so that when I'm shooting outside, 99% of the time, I just set my white balance to a fixed daylight white balance, and I turn off auto white balance adjustment all together, because I know I can just deal with it in post-production. And speaking of color in your images, RAW files have another trick up their sleeve that allow you to take so images and transform them like this into much more beautiful landscape photos. So I want you to imagine this, right? You're painting a picture of a landscape scene and you've only got a handful of colors to play with. Well, obviously it's going to be more difficult to make that scene look epic or beautiful compared with if you had a wider selection of colors to use, right? Well, JPEG files live within the sRGB color space, and the sRGB color space contains around 16.7 million colors, which obviously sounds like an absolute boatload, until you realize that this is the smallest color space that's out there. Now, alternatively, if you open a RAW file in Lightroom in the Pro Photo color space, then you've got over 281 trillion colors. That's with a T, right? Trillion colors to play with. And practically, the larger color space means that you can have less banding, less clipping, and less messing around in issues when you're editing your images. That in turn means that you can push them harder to potentially get better results in the edit. And this is especially important if you're going to use lots of masks when editing your image, which is something that I cover in detail in my Landscape Mastery program. This student shared that the masking training alone was worth the investment into the training. And if you want to learn more about my program that helps amateur photographers get professional level results in the next 6 weeks, then click the link in the description. So with all that said, if RAW is so powerful, why does JPEG even still exist? And are there any scenarios for landscape photographers where it makes more sense to use JPEG over RAW? Well, in fast-paced environments like news photography or sports photography, turnaround time matters absolutely more than pure image quality. Editors need images seconds after the shot, and JPEG is faster to write, it's easier to preview, it's quicker to transfer. JPEG is also easier to email, to text, to share on social media, and so that makes it useful for social media photographers, event photographers, and anyone who needs to basically deliver files quickly. But for landscape photography, well, that time pressure just does not exist. If you're watching a video like this, you're looking for professional level results, not speed. And shooting in RAW is going to give you the control that you need to make the most of every image that you take. So now that you know why shooting in RAW is essential for rescuing blown highlights and crushed shadows, what if I told you that there was a secret killer that's stopping you from getting professional level results? And it's not your file format, it's not the lens that you're using, it's not your camera body. Well, click this video to learn the 6 ISO mistakes that landscape photographers make and a dead simple framework to get tack sharp, print worthy shots every single time.